It's Just a Costume by Hill Hank. Have you ever wondered how hot the mascots at Walt Disney World must get in that humid Florida air? Or how they can dance around and wave without ever seeing them get tired? I never really paid much mind to it. I always just wanted to believe that it was that Disney magic that kept those poor people going in those burning costumes. But like most things, unfortunately, it's just not that simple. It was the summer of 2006. I was 14 at the time. I took a well-deserved vacation with my family down to Florida to have a magical vacation at the happiest place on earth. Along with my mom, my sister, and of course me, was my Uncle Rick. He lived in Florida, so it wasn't uncommon for him to accompany us to our trips to Walt Disney World. We visited Disneyland often because it was only about a 5-hour drive from our home in Phoenix. So, as you can imagine, it was a big treat for us to fly down to Florida. Me, my mom, my sister, we're all huge Disney fans. And when I say huge, I mean huge. Disney memorabilia all over our house. Seeing Disney movies on opening day, night, anything Disney, we've done it. That's one of the reasons this story is so painful to tell, along with many others. Uncle Rick, on the other hand, wasn't much of a Disney buff. In fact, he was the opposite. He was a very religious man, always rambling about the good old days when he was a teacher at Sunday school. Uncle Rick was significantly older than my mother. They were 12 years apart, I think. I was never a religious kid, nor am I now, but that didn't affect my relationship with Uncle Rick. He was a great man, always happy, funny, always something about him that made everyone who knew him smile when you brought him up. I couldn't ask for a better man to be my mother's brother. Uncle Rick always had his likes and dislikes about Disney World. His dislikes consisted of the unnatural happiness of the people there, the crowds, the loud noises, the rides. I don't know how he couldn't have loved Pirates of the Caribbean either. And especially the way the people in the mascot costumes had to stand there for extended periods of time in the blazing heat, just so people could get a picture with them. I tried explaining to him that that was their job and that they aren't in any danger, but he would always find a way to counter my argument. Oh, and his likes also consisted of the turkey legs, even though he would still complain that they're overpriced. He never seemed pleased when he was at Disney World. It was obvious that the only reason he was there was he wanted to spend time with us. This trip to Disney was different though. Everything was fine and dandy, right up until we pulled up to the gates of Walt Disney World that greet you at the entrance of the Disney property. I noticed that he had an uneasy look on his face after we passed under it, and then he got unusually quiet when we were in the parking lot and left the car. Instead of talking about the usual stories of the good old days, he began to talk about a much darker subject. Hell. It took me off guard considering he never really brings up this subject unless he's telling us not to say it. I just looked at him as he went on talking about the suffering that goes on down there, and how he hopes we never have to experience anything like it. Then my mom, when she overheard his ramblings, abruptly ordered him to cut it out and just be happy that you're here. I've never heard Uncle Rick talk like that. He had always been so joyful. I could tell from his tone he was genuinely concerned, but I just couldn't figure out what had gotten into him to make him that upset. I also couldn't get what he said out of my head. I don't want you to ever experience suffering like that. I didn't know what he meant. He seemed very unlike himself. He was so sad. Not frustrated, not annoyed, just sad. I kept asking him what was wrong, but he would just look the other way and ignore me. We had been at the Magic Kingdom Park for about an hour and a half, though I wasn't able to enjoy myself considering I was concerned for Uncle Rick the whole time, and we had gone on a few rides. Uncle Rick usually tends to go on the rides with us, even though he doesn't exactly enjoy them. But this time, he refused to go on any. He just sat near the exit waiting for us to get off. We were about to go on the Haunted Mansion ride when I decided to hold off and sit down with Rick. I took a seat next to him and just sat there, quietly. for about a half an hour. If you've ever been to Disneyland or Disney World, then you know how long these lines can get. Finally, he muttered something to me. "What?" I said, trying to focus on him. I was told something bad would happen today. I could barely understand his quiet voice over all the commotion around us. "What? By who?" I urgently said back to him. "Something unholy," he said as a tear rolled down his cheek. My heart dropped. This wasn't my usual Uncle Rick talking. This Uncle Rick was just a sad, miserable shell of himself. My sister and Mom finally got off the ride. I remember looking up to her, seeing my joyful mom staring down at me. I had been so genuinely sad that my Uncle Rick was so miserable that I too had started crying. Though I didn't even notice until my mom shouted at me, "Seriously? You too? You've got to be kidding me. Do you know how much goddamn money I spent to get this place just so you can have a good time?" That's when I realized I was at the happiest place on earth, and I was still crying like a baby. I stood up and said, "You're right, let's go for a ride on Space Mountain. You coming, Uncle Rick?" I remember the look he gave me. It was a look of absolute sorrow. I felt guilty as he slowly pried himself off the bench. On our way over to Space Mountain, we came across a Mickey Mouse mascot giving out autographs and taking photos with excited children. My sister, who was younger than I was, begged my mom to get a picture with Mickey. My mom gave in and walked over. I kept looking over my shoulder to check on Uncle Rick, whose pace had slowed down as we approached the mascot. My mom and sister stood in line eager to get the picture with Mickey. I, on the other hand, was about 10 feet away from them waiting for Uncle Rick. I felt almost angry at my mom for not sympathizing with her own brother, even though something was obviously wrong with him. I stood there waiting for him. When he finally caught up, I grabbed his hand to assist him over. But as our palms met, I noticed his hand was shockingly cold. I gasped and jerked my hand away in shock. "Uncle Rick, are you okay?" I said to him in a shaky voice. He just stared at me. His face was different than it had been before. Didn't even look like my Uncle Rick at all. It looked like the epitome of misery. I wanted to break down crying. I've never seen such a disturbing sight in my life. Not disturbing in a way that made me frightened. It was disturbing in a way that affected me as a person, in a way that I know I'll never be able to forget. I ran over to my mom and grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." She looked at me with a puzzled look on her face. "No, we don't. Your Uncle Rick is just fine. She stopped mid-sentence and looked behind me, with a shocked look on her face. I was hesitant to turn around by the look on her face because I knew I was about to see something that was going to be bad. I never imagined how bad it actually was. I finally convinced myself to turn around. Before me, I saw my Uncle Rick. Standing maybe 15 feet away, he was looking at the Mickey mascot, and the Mickey mascot was looking at him. That's when I noticed that Mickey's body was facing the opposite direction of Mickey's head. I couldn't understand why the mascot looked like that. Wouldn't the Disney employees have put a stop to this? What's happening? That's when it happened. In an instant, Mickey let out this deafening sound that resembled 1,000 people screaming. I cut my ears to try to drown out the noise, but it was no use. Then, just as it started, the noise stopped. I looked up at Mickey and he was no more than 2 feet from my face. Its face was distorted. It had black eyes with small white pupils and huge rat-like teeth in the front, surrounded by what looked like hundreds of bloody human teeth filling the gums of his mouth. The skin of the mascot was gray with a material that looked aged and rotten. Then I heard it say, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 people talking at once,
"We are nothing more than puppets. Nothing but a test of what's to come."
I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only watch as, in the blink of an eye, the Mickey was standing in front of my Uncle Rick. The mascot's head slowly lifted off its body with an unseen force. I saw a reddish black liquid pour out of its neck and start to spill down the body of the mascot. my Uncle Rick started screaming bloody murder. And then something happened. I'm not sure what. I turned my head and covered my ears in an attempt to shield myself from what was happening to my Uncle Rick. I then woke up in a cold sweat on the concrete as my family and some Disney crew members crowded around me. I saw my Uncle Rick looking down at me with concern in his eyes. I jolted to my feet and grabbed my uncle by the arm. "Please, Rick, we need to go. Please." He placed his hand on mine. It was warm again. He told me with a smile on his face that everything was okay. I had just fainted from the heat. I know that I didn't faint. It took me a few seconds to come back to reality. When I did, I hugged my Uncle Rick like I've never hugged anyone before. I sat down in the cast members only area to cool down, even though I really wasn't that hot. They gave me some water and told me to relax, that the paramedics will be there soon. I assured them that I was fine, mainly just because I wanted to get the hell out of there. But my efforts were useless. Their paramedics arrived and I was taken to the nearest emergency room. The nurse did some tests as I talked to the doctor for a while. I was fine. There was nothing wrong with me. I know what I saw was real. I wouldn't just imagine that. And even if I did, nothing imaginary could be that real. I laid in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling for a good 2 hours. That's when it occurred to me. The place they took me to sit down after I supposedly fainted was one of the mascot entries and exits. I felt cold recalling seeing the reddish-black liquid on the floor in the middle of the entrance with a wet floor sign on it. It was the same liquid that I saw coming out of the costume. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. I was trying to convince myself that they were right. I somehow did faint, and it was all imaginary. But why the hell was there liquid on the floor? I started to panic when my mom slowly walked in the room. Her cheeks were drenched in tears and her hands were filled with tissues. I stopped dead in my tracks. I don't know how, but I knew. I knew something happened to my Uncle Rick. She sat down in the chair next to my bed and put her hand on mine. She told me what had happened. Every word felt like a knife sinking deeper and deeper into my heart. My Uncle Rick had shot himself that night. He had a Bible clenched in his hand when he did it. He was dead. I knew why, but no one else would. A happy, joyful, funny man like him doesn't just decide he wants to blow his brains out one night. No, something happened to him. That mascot did something to him that I didn't see because I looked away. I feel like if I never looked away, I could have somehow saved him. But I can't now. He's dead. I don't have anything to do with Disney anymore. When I moved out of my mom's house, I burned everything Disney that I owned. I refused to go back there. I don't know what I saw that day, even though I can still see it as clear as day. I feel sick every time I think of what happened. I don't look for answers, though. I never did. I don't want to know what it was. I think knowing would be 1,000 times worse than remaining clueless. All I know is that it seems like there's something other than fun in the atmosphere, or the job benefits that keep people working at Disney. Maybe there's something more to life in general, something we'll never understand till we're dead. Maybe I did just faint, though. Maybe it was just a costume. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my $10 and above patrons. If you want to get thanked at the end of every video, please consider becoming a patron at the $10 or above tier. I'll give you a shout out, and if you have a channel, I'll shout that out too. Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, Chaos X. Thank you so much, guys. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. I really appreciate it.